It's time now, though, for our next keynote speaker for Future State. She's a Cabrogal woman of the Darug-speaking nation of Sydney. Through the Indigenous edu-tech company she founded, Indigital, Mikaela Jade develops innovative ways to digitise and translate knowledge and culture from remote and ancient communities. Her aim is for Indigital to help create meaningful pathways for Indigenous people into the digital economy. So in a way, she is using the past to inform the present and inspire the future. So please give a warm warami, kia ora, no mai, haere mai to Mikaela Jade.
Thank you. Well, warami, that is a Cabrogal Darug word for I see you. And I'm so pleased to be standing today on the beautiful Tamaki Makaro, Auckland. And I want to pay my respects and acknowledge our elders past and present, including the hapu and iwi that traditionally call this place home. It's such a beautiful home. I would also like to acknowledge my traditional owners, the Cabrogal people, who have endured 240 years of colonisation. And unlike Māori here, we don't have any treaty to establish our sovereignty in our country. So I'm very grateful to my elders who I get to work with every day back at home, who are teaching me my own knowledge, language and law systems. And today, I'm going to ask you to put your hands up. How many people know their parents? Put them up high, yeah. Keep them up if you know your grandparents, great-grandparents. Yeah, have a look around the room. Great-great-grandparents. Yeah, not a lot of us know our great-great-grandparents. Well, as our cultural responsibility as First Nations people is to know not just our line, but our country. And that's really our first ask when we're exploring the opportunities to work between First Nations and non-First Nations people. So I'm encouraging you today, if you couldn't put your hand up to know your fourth generation ancestor, to have an explore into your own lineage and your own country that you come from before you start working with our people, because 100% the first question our mob are going to ask you is, who are you from and where are you from? And if you can answer those with your hand on your heart and in full ownership and knowledge of those two pieces of information about your own story, our mob are going to be able to work with you in a much easier way. So that's where we start. Okay, is this just a data centre? You might notice that there's some cultural artworks on the front. I think it says they're on the ancillary buildings of this data centre. Have you seen Indigenous knowledge systems embedded in buildings or in places or along walks or in places that you might go on holidays and wondered what it means for our people? I'm going to leave you there with that thought as we explore. Why do First Nations people want to leave our mark on digital technologies? Why do First Nations people want to be deeply involved in the development of these technologies? And why would we start with a data centre? Mobs, people, ancestors, our people, First Nations people, there's 400 million First Nations people across the world, are deeply connected to our lands, and we're deeply connected to each other. And this was a diagram that was created in 1993 by some of the Kimberley mob, trying to explain to non-Indigenous people how we see our homeland, Australia. You can see that it is a being. So from Melbourne down is the legs and feet. Just below my country, between sort of Orbost and Sydney, is the pelvis. Then we have the ribs. Then we have our shoulders. And the top of our country is our head and our neck. We see her as we see our people. We see our neighbours as we see our people, and we have songlines and stories that connect us to each other and through time. So when I started working in 2012 in augmented, mixed and virtual realities, I had a pretty tough time because the way that these technologies were being spoken to and spoken about to our people was through STEM. Who's heard of STEM? Everyone's talking about STEM right now. It's really important. We're spending lots of money in our education system. But to our people, STEM is something that is on a tree. A bank is something that's on a river. We needed to understand a different way to talk about STEM, and so we could see our culture in it from the first step. So instead of talking about maths, we started talking about the patterns we see. And as someone who works in machine learning and training machines, that's really all maths is to our people, is patterns. It's patterns to all people, I think. And the way that we codify patterns is how we create the algorithms that are intended to serve us. Instead of talking about engineering, we started talking about the things that we make, from baskets to fish traps to new systems and structures to build, harvest, protect, grow. And this engineering can still be seen today. The people at Barorina have the oldest living engineering structure known to humankind, and it's still in operation today, and it's the Barorina fish traps. They're still harvesting fish the way that our people harvested fish 80,000 years ago, using the same engineering. The technologies that we're talking about, AI, machine learning, the Metaverse, it's really just tools. It's the tools that we always used and will always use to help us look after country, to look after each other. And finally, science. Science conjures up all sorts of images about people in lab coats working with glass beakers. For us, science is really what we know about country, what we know about systems and relationships, and what we know about cause and effect of 80,000 years of continuous science experiments. We know a lot about how the world works. So I think that is a really exciting foundation from which to engage our people in the work that you might be doing in your companies and in business. But this is why it might feel like everything's changing. So we've gone from 3.0, we're talking about 4.0 in this area of deep innovation. With coordination, we've gone from networks and negotiation to an awareness-based collective action. We've looked at nature through a regulated commodity, and now we're seeing nature as a cultivated commons. As we all experience the threats of climate change, we're realising that we all have a shared responsibility for looking after country. Our labour markets are shifting from regulated labour markets to entrepreneurship. Capital, which is really interesting, is going from capital as a regulated commodity to dedicated capital, where that capital is externally aware. Not only are you wanting to invest for a return on investment, you're wanting to invest for an environmental and social and governance return on investment. And so are your stakeholders. If you don't get that part right now, you may not be in business for very long. Technology, we're going from system-centric automation to human-centric technologies. And I think something really interesting about 4.0 is we have to walk a really fine line here that we don't cross into technology-centric technologies. We're moving from leadership that's participative to co-creative and collective presence leadership. We're doing it together. We don't see the leader as the person in front anymore. We're seeing it as something that we achieve together, and we can swap in and out of who's leading in different areas of companies. And consumption, We're going from a partial consciousness of what we consume to conscious consumption. We want to know where the stuff comes from. We want to know who was involved in the value chain of producing that thing. And we want to know where it's going to end up when we're finished with it. All of this 4.0 deep innovation feels a lot like the way that First Nations people think about the world. So I think we're really greatly placed to give advice of that. Everyone's been talking to me in the last few days about the Indigenous digital divide. There is a divide between First Nations and non-Indigenous peoples across the world, and that's to do with access and hardware. It's also to do with starting way back. Our starting block was way, way back, where we were excluded from these economies. But we've caught up, and we actually have a great value proposition moving forward into this deep innovation 4.0. I don't know if many of you saw this from the World Economic Forum 2 weeks ago. It's actually from the Future of Jobs report that came out. And I think it's super interesting to look through this list. See, analytical thinking, creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, agility, and the list goes on, and we're not getting to the tech skills till like number 15. The skills that people are looking for in companies are not really focused on tech. We can teach tech, but we need all of these other skills first. And when I was reading about these skills, I thought, wow, this sounds a lot like my people. We do all this automatically as part of our culture, as part of our ways of knowing, being, and doing. So I work in the Metaverse, or helping to build the Metaverse, because it doesn't exist yet. But what I noticed globally is that the Metaverse is being described like this. This is the value stack. And I was able to contribute to this demystifying the consumer Metaverse work early this year. And when it was published, I was like, this is interesting. All of the efforts to engage our people are in the experience layer. I couldn't find anyone else in the world, any other First Nations communities that were penetrating through the stack. And I can understand why our mobs are being encouraged to be part of the experience layer of the Metaverse, because we create beautiful artworks, we create visually compelling content, and all of these artworks and content are deeply imbued with meaning and story and connection to each other and connection to country and connection to the product, the service. We also talk about our past aspirations and we talk about our future aspirations. Our people are being encouraged to work in this experience layer because our assets are of value in the Metaverse, in gaming, in products, in storytelling, and we only really need to look to Disney to see how compelling First Nations stories can be when we attach them to a brand. We're working at Indigital to make sure that we penetrate the entire value stack of the Metaverse. And for us, that means helping to design the economy that sits under the experience layer. What do our people value as an economy? What worked for us in the past that might be relevant in designing the economic layer of the Metaverse? How do we think about collective intellectual property, for example? So that's been a really interesting exploration for our people, because with modern law, it only acknowledges the creator. So in Australia, if we create something, the copyright is vested in the creator. But of course, with the metaverse, as we're contributing more experiences and content and worlds and avatars and narratives, they're built on by the users. So the initial world creator is going to have their creation added to, and it's going to be this continuous additive economy in there. Well, how do we deal with collective IP? Our people have been designing that for the last 40 years in the legal system. We have some really great personal experience about how we might shape legislation to help recognise multi-layered copyright. Digital identity is a really interesting one. I've been sitting in a lot of conversations about identity in the metaverse lately, not just in Australia, but internationally. And what I'm hearing everyone say is so good. I can show up as anyone or anything. I don't have to bring myself as an identity to the metaverse, which sounds great. Lots of people are like, I want to be skinny, or I want to have bigger boobs. And that's really great because at the moment with Ready Player Me and all of those things, you almost certainly have to have those things as a woman, which is very confronting. However, when First Nations people are gathering and we're having our cultural yarns, who we are and our identity is central to the entire conversation. It's central to whether you're invited to be a part of that conversation or not. It's central to whether you can hear parts of that information or not. We have men's business, we have women's business, we have business for elders who have worked for 30 or 40 years to gain the highest level of knowledge systems in our tribes. We have children who shouldn't hear things till they go through initiation. So when our people are designing parts of the metaverse around digital identity, it's really important to us that we keep our cultural identity and that we can identify other people that are not part of our community. How do you do that? If people want anonymity and they want to be able to turn up as anyone that they want. As a Darug woman, I've had a lot of people in my life say to me, I think I was First Nations in a past life. Well, do they get to be First Nations in the metaverse life? And how do I know? Or how do my community know? Software and platforms. So, as someone that's working in holograms and as a hologram for a lot of my actual work, I've been involved in some experimental software and in experimental platforms in devices like HoloLens, where I have been presenting just like on a stage like this, but as a hologram. So I was presenting from my living room in Canberra, and I had colleagues that were also presenting as holograms in Sydney and in Brisbane. And in the hologram software, I could see those two men in my living room as holograms, like they could see each other in their living rooms and myself. And the people who were a crowd like you were seeing the three of us on stage as holograms. But there was a problem with the software. As we were presenting and sharing this story of how cool it was that we were all holograms and the metaverse had arrived and how amazing it was that we'd had this technological feat that we could actually become holograms and present somewhere, I lost perspective of Dan. I could not see Dan's hologram anymore. I could see my other colleague, and the digital ring that we had to orientate us to where we were as opposed to each other still showed Dan there, and I could hear him. And I'm looking around like this. I'm like, Dan, I can't see you anywhere. Like, are you still in the environment? And looking down, because he could be through the floor, he could be anywhere. And then I did look down, and his digital head was in my crotch. Yeah, it sounds really funny. But I was sexually assaulted when I was 17. And having a photorealistic man's head in my crotch in such an uninvited and unexpected way was so shocking. And I was presenting live to an audience just like you. And the only things that came out of my lips was, Dan, your head is in my crutch. I can't share with you the shame that I felt in that moment. And all of professional me was standing and just thinking, it's just data and light. Dan's head is not in my crutch. But we've created such immersive experiences in these technologies, your brain can't rationalise that in the moment. I then asked the team I was working with who the developers were. And they were a crew of guys in their 20s. And they hadn't thought for a second that maybe women don't want digital holograms within our bubble. I don't know if you guys have a bubble, mine's about this wide. I don't really want anyone in it unless I invite them in. So that was really, that was a moment where I thought, this is really why diversity matters. This is really why it matters to have women involved. This is why it matters to have First Nations involved. Because I told you I was a hologram, but I had to turn up as a hologram that didn't look like me, that didn't allow me to have my cultural adornments. I couldn't wear my ancestors' beautiful gift that I was given by my elders. Couldn't wear my possum earrings. None of the identity in the way that the software had been built allowed me to express myself as a cultural person. The last part is that infrastructure and network. So I showed you a photo of a data center at the start. And it occurred to me that all of this comes from country, from these massive facilities we put on country, from these massive facilities that are $1 billion to create, from these massive facilities that take enormous amounts of energy and water to manage the data flows that we have created. We've just become so obsessed with collecting data, not thinking about the environmental or cultural costs of actually managing that data. So last year, my community got deeply involved in helping to develop a data center. And what we came up with, so the previous slide, you will notice the experience, economy, digital, identity, software platforms, infrastructure network, actually goes from number 1 in the diagram down to number 5. But we were like, imagine we flipped all that and we came at it through a cultural lens. And we first thought in this whole stack of value experience, of value in the metaverse experience, of country, culture, energy, and water. I worked with 36 of my mob, my family. These are direct blood relatives. And I can tell you that's quite terrifying. Everyone has that auntie, right, that you don't really want to make the phone call to. But we managed to overcome our differences because what was being placed on our country was significant. We all went on country, we took our shoes off, and we came together as a mob who had cultural responsibility for that place for 80,000 years. We came together for the first time as a family in 100 years over this data center. It was so powerful. We allowed country to speak through our elders. We sensed the land. We got the colour palettes for the artwork that I showed you through country. We explored what country was, what country is, what country will be. And I think one of the best moments of sitting together on country, thinking deeply about the earth that this facility was going on, was when my auntie piped up to the developers and said, but what happens when you finish with this data center? And the architects were like, what do you mean? And she said, when you're done with it, what happens with it? And he goes, well, it's going to be here for 40 years. And she goes, I know that. That's why there's this 10-year-old here, because when they're 60, they're going to remember the commitments that you made to our people about this building, and they're going to remember what the responsibility is for finishing this. We think in generations in our communities and in our businesses. The hardest thing as a tech founder, being a First Nations woman, is answering that question for a capital raise: what is your exit strategy? My exit strategy is in 2170. You're going to have to ask my descendants. But we think in really long terms, and I think that is one of the best questions we can ask when we're developing any kind of content, is what happens after it. Because all the resources that come, energy, water, minerals, country, and the lending of our culture to this, sometimes comes from other country, other mobs, having their country destroyed for the resources that create these. And where will it go? It goes on to someone else's country when we dispose it. So we wanted to honour all that. So when we look at this as Darug Mob, we don't see this as an artwork on a building. We see this as the opportunity to leave our cultural knowledge, language, and law for our next generations to say, we were involved in this, we worked together on this, and we started at the base of that value stack of the technology platforms we're working in now. What I haven't shared with you is that this was not a single artist that did this artwork. When we were sitting on country for the first time in 100 years together, we didn't want this message to be transmitted through one person. There was too much cultural law in what we wanted to share on that side. So working in machine learning, I suggested to the mob that we use a machine learning algorithm to help us create the artwork. And our mob got really excited about that because they've heard about machine learning. They wanted to understand the whole process. So for the next 4 months, we met online every single week as a family. Everyone showed up every time. And we went through what it took to design a machine learning algorithm, the data points that we needed to use to have the training material, and the untrained data points. And we taught them how to train that machine learning algorithm until we got a story that we were all confident and comfortable with. And this story, and another piece of art that goes inside this building that we created, speaks to our concept of resilience. That was the yarn that kept coming up on country, is we're resilient, we're still here. And as we started unpacking what that meant, we have 250 ways in our language to describe resilience and still being here and being a vibrant culture. So we use that as the foundation of our data points to train this machine learning algorithm to help us express our culture, knowledge, language, and law. And what did that do for our mob? They saw they can do it. They got excited about critical technologies. They started asking about, well, what is the purpose of a data center on our country? They started getting interested in the engineering process. They started getting interested in the scientific processes. They started thinking about quantum computing, and they started seeing opportunity. And from that, our elders are going on to do the Australian Company Directors Foundations of Directors course. They want to be on boards of these companies that are setting up on our country. Some of our children have diverted what they wanted to do in their career from going into things like law, which might be disrupted quite a lot by AI, into more creative industries that are associated with the metaverse. A lot of kids want to work in our company, which is great, and we've actually recruited 2 of them that are doing jobs on country now. And then from that, we work with 100 schools around this facility and teach all of those kids, 500 kids, knowledge, language, and law, the stories of the land where they're working, living, playing, being educated, and how to work with our community in expressing our culture in augmented reality storytelling. So we saw this project as an opportunity to practice the circularity of our culture through the entire metaverse stack and invite our people to not just be part of the project, but also to lead. Thank you for listening to my yarn.
So many questions for you, so many deep topics. Thank you very much for sharing with us. Come sit with me on the couch here. So we have lots and lots of questions coming through from Slido, and I'm going to start with one. Keep coming through. Lots of them saying thank you. It's great to have this conversation. Corey wants to know, what is the best way to protect our cultural ideas and our cultural traditions and these practices in Web 3.0, so Metaverse, when we are sharing it openly with the world?
100%. Great question, and where we always start, actually. So understanding what our rights are around our knowledge, language, and law is foundational to being able to answer that question. Understanding our cultural protocols and responsibilities for that knowledge is the second layer of that question. And then having an agreed way forward with your elders and knowledge holders about what will be expressed and how it will be expressed. Now, unfortunately, other mob in the room will understand this is happening as well as the concept of digital twins. So a lot of our objects, our artworks, our whole entire landscapes are being made into digital twins. And then they're being placed on platforms like Sketchfab and getting $30 a download. But some of the content that's on there is extremely sacred and is as sophisticated as the mobile phone in your pocket and is not for sale. So being aware of what we're creating, and just because we can, it doesn't mean that we should.
Another question, how can we as non-Indigenous peoples ensure that we are doing the right thing and trying to make authentic spaces in our digital future?
Yeah, great question. Well, the first part of that is understanding your own story and being able to come to our people with your own story, like we mentioned earlier in the yarn before, is who you are, who you come from, what country you live on, and what's your intention of wanting to work with our people. I think particularly in Australia, a lot of businesses now are wanting a reconciliation action plan because of ESG requirements that they need to meet for shareholders and for wanting to be seen to be proactive in the Indigenous space. But the first question that a really good reconciliation action plan consultant will tell you is, well, they'll ask you actually, why do you want it? So being clear with that messaging at the start is very important. And there are also brilliant Māori and other First Nations businesses that do this as their bread and butter. So not having to go it alone is probably the best message, is find those mob from community that do this on the day-to-day. There are weavers. They weave our culture and non-Indigenous businesses together.
Now, this is a tough one from Thomas. What is the notion of history of place in a metaverse, which is by its nature impermanent?
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick yarn, which might highlight some of the challenges that we're facing about that. So my country is very important to myself and my people, and we have a very special place on the Parramatta River where, since the time of colonisation, our people have always been welcome to come and practice cultural knowledge, language and law, ceremony, fishing. And when that place was when the lady died, she put that place into the care of a private hospital, which became a women's hospital where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and other women who weren't married could have babies safely. And we know not a lot of the babies made it. And in 2021, it was decided, and through 7 years of trying to fight the destruction of this place, it was decided that it would be bulldozed by the government. But before they did that, they took a full-scale digital twin of that place. So our question as mob from there is, how do we now honour our ancestors and those babies when we know the only place that we can go to be who we are and to carry out our custodial responsibilities is into a digital twin.